Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me today. I thought I would answer upper tier patron emails. This first email is from upper tier patron Alyssa from Los Angeles. She writes, what schema would you speculate this as? Due to glass child syndrome, all right, just chiming in here, she's saying that she has glass child syndrome, and I had to look this up on the internet. And apparently it is, glass children are siblings of a person with a disability. So the word glass means that the caregivers, parents tend to see right through the glass child because they're taking care of the other child with a disability. All right. So Alyssa says, due to glass child syndrome, I have an inherent belief from young childhood that my mere existence is a burden to everyone around me if I ever express any of my needs. So I am wholly focused on fulfilling everyone else's needs. I looked up a list of common schemas and was unsure of how it would be classified. I am in therapy and working on it, but I was just curious. End of email. Yeah, so I like this game of identify the schema. And although let's explore what schemas we might categorize it within the standard theory of schema therapy put forth by Jung. But when I work with clients, I don't necessarily slot them into one of these 18 schemas. I just stick to the language that the client is using. So for you, Alyssa, I would just call this I am a burden schema, because that fits closer to home than whatever sort of category we might put you in, because those are your words. And I would also have the schema of I'm here to fulfill everyone else's needs. That's the way you're phrasing it. Butler syndrome is what Bob calls it. There's no schema called Butler syndrome, but for Bob, it fits that's the word that he uses. So. But if we were to slot it into the different schemas, off the top of my head, it sounds like you might be a candidate for schema number 3, which is emotional deprivation, or what I call people don't care about me. And the items that one would agree with if one has the schema would be the following. I've never had a consistent person to depend on for advice and emotional support. Generally speaking, no one has ever really been there to meet my emotional needs. I haven't gotten enough love and nurturance from others. For most of my life, I've never been someone's main relationship. For most of my life, I have not had someone who really cares to listen or understand me. So those are items that if you agree with most of those significantly, then you might be categorized as someone who suffers from what I call the people don't care about me schema. But I would also perhaps just use your words, which is I am a burden. Which kind of summarizes it. The other schema that you are describing seemingly is what we call self-sacrifice, maybe self-sacrifice, but also subjugation, or I must please others. So items from this schema these are my words. I've adapted Jung's model, but if you agree with some or most of these, it could indicate that this is the schema you're describing when you're saying that you're wholly focused on fulfilling everyone else's needs. I usually let other people have their way because I'm afraid of the consequences. In relationships, I let other people make the decisions. I often don't know what I want. I hate confrontations. If I assert what I want, something bad will happen, that sort of thing. So, yeah, let's go on to more emails. And by the way, if I'm going to actually finish reading everyone's email by the next, around this end of the year, beginning of the year, 2023, then I have to go a lot faster. I have to not respond as lengthily to every single email the way I've been doing this week. And the other thing I want to tell you is that if I'm going to try to get to every single email, but I can't get to every single email because I think it would literally take me years, like no joke. So some emails that I think I've already answered, I'm just going to figure that you will know that I answered at least a question that was similar to yours that hopefully addresses your question. The other thing is that I need to revise my expectation, everyone, and I've talked about this before, that I will answer every email. I can't. I need to tell everyone that consider it like a 50-50 chance that I might get to your email. And that's only if you're an upper tier patron, because I give preference to that for obvious reasons. If you're a patron, then, maybe it's a 20% chance. And if you're not a patron, then I would give it a pretty low chance, but, a possible chance that I'll get to your email. So I just want to make sure that expectation is out there so that I don't deceive anyone and hurt anyone's feelings. Because, I love the emails. It gives me, your questions are so great, and they obviously give me content, and I learn a lot from your questions because, I learn, but also I learn like what holes in my explanations I might have had. I always, as a professor, I need questions to tell me what my lectures are deficient in. I want the information to be understood. And if there are questions, then, and of course there will be questions, then that gives me the opportunity to, fully help you to understand what I'm trying to explain, So along these lines, I'm going to try to address all the emails, and I'm going to go through, because I have several documents, and there might be literally thousands of emails that I'm going to try to address, or at least review to see if I should read on, in this series of episodes going on right now. And then at the end of those episodes, I'm going to actually delete everything in my files. And so if you email me a question January, February of 2023, or you emailed me a question in the end of 2022, there's a chance that that email will get sort of swept up in this process, because starting in March-ish 2023, I just want to start with a completely clean slate. I don't want a single email that is left in my documents, because I have that compulsive need. I'm one of those people that likes to get to inbox zero. I want to be email psychology in Seattle 0 at some point. So, because, some of the questions that people have submitted, they might have submitted them, like, no joke, 3 years ago. Because I don't hold on to the dates that people will send them in. So these people might not, there's a chance they don't even listen to the podcast anymore. So why should I even read that? So I need to wipe the slate clean. I was thinking about doing this every year, just like answer all the emails I can, and then wipe the slate clean, and you can resubmit a question if you felt like I didn't get to it. All right, this next email is from upper tier patron Jen from Pennsylvania. She writes, could you do an episode on compulsive lying, specifically in children? I am very worried about my 10-year-old son. He's always enjoyed lying, as a lot of kids do, to get out of trouble, but as he grows, I notice he lies about literally everything. Even if there are no supposed consequences, he will still lie. Even though he sees me witness the truth, he will lie anyway, and lie and not admit it. And his biological father was like this too, but my son has never known him. So what could be causing this pathological lying? We don't typically lie in our family, and anytime our kids witness a white lie, we tend to discuss it with them and admit it's wrong. We also aren't very strict, and we won't spank or shout as a consequence when he does something wrong. It's killing me because I can't understand his motivation to lie so much. Thanks so much for considering my question to be on your show. End of email. Yeah. So you're good to point out, maybe based on other statements that I've said, that there are the common reasons that kids will compulsively lie, pathologically lie, and you describe it well, that they will lie about a lot of things. They will lie even when it doesn't serve them. They will lie even when it is completely illogical to do so. When everyone knows, including them, that that they're lying, they will continue to lie. It's something that people, including kids and adults, will do, and the reasons for it usually are because it served them when they were young to get out of trouble. They were being abused, or there was some kind of terror involved, and they just learned to, as a knee-jerk reaction, lie because it saved their life, or helped them to survive. And so there's no checks and balances. There's no editor. They just automatically lie, and they have tremendous anxiety when they think they're about to be in trouble. And it's a distortion. You could almost consider it like a mini personality disorder, and it takes a long time to change, especially, and also there's a habitual nature to it as well. The neurological pathways become very strong. The lying neurological pathways become very strong, and thus are more likely to engage when the opportunity or the situation arises. So, but you're good to point out that you're saying, look, we're not very strict, and we don't spank or shout at our kids, And we also don't lie ourselves, so we aren't modeling lying to the kids. And he doesn't have any reason to lie to get out of trouble or something. So I don't understand. But you also point out that his biological father, who he hasn't had any contact with, also lied a lot. So is it genetic? And the answer is we don't know, because we don't know anything about the cause of human behavior as individuals. But it's possible that, there's a few possibilities. One is that it's just a phase. Kids go through phases, and if you have enough kids or you've been around enough kids, you know that. On the other hand, there are things that often will become mainstays in one's personality. Like, there's a chance that this lying behavior will just naturally go away as they just learn how to not do it, because there's a lot of natural consequences to lying, to you, to classmates, to teachers. They will be rejected because of it. They will be potentially humiliated. People will make fun of them, or people will point it out, like, you can't do that. Or they'll be punished twice as long. There's a lot of real consequences, social and otherwise, that will happen to him regardless of what you do. I'm guessing you're also doing consequences to him, right? At the very least, I was trying to convince him not to lie and giving him the impression that you would love him, or not love him, but that you would be more proud of him, I guess, if he be more approval of his behavior if he were not to lie. That's probably a better phrase. Anyway, so there's a chance that he'll just grow out of it, and kids sometimes just go through phases. There's also a chance that regardless of anything that anyone does, he will continue to do this into adulthood. In the United States, I think in particular, we have in certain circles, we have this notion that somehow you have the power as a parent to shape your child's personality and behavior and patterns. And that's good that you believe that, because you take responsibility for the parts that you do have responsibility for and do have an effect on. But I've been around the block enough times and been with enough kids and families to understand that kids are independent human beings with their own personalities, their own decisions, their own volition, their own development, their own point of view. And you can try to change it, and you should try to change it. If your 10-year-old kid, for example, just dedicates himself to continuing to do this, he might even believe you. He might even say, yeah, you know what? My mom's right. I probably shouldn't lie. But if he just wakes up in the morning and says, but I don't care, that's up to him. He can make that choice. So do what you can do, but also just recognize that the notion that somehow you have complete control over the molding of your child is a false one. Anyone who has like a 30-year-old child that has difficulties understands this, In fact, a lot of the times when people have kids that they're really proud of, I often just think, well, to some extent, you just rolled the dice and the dice came up well for you, because you could have easily rolled the dice in a different way. And I'm not talking about just genetics. They're human beings. Your 10-year-old son is a fully fledged human being with his own brain, his own personality, and his own decision-making process. He has his own free will. He can decide to do what he wants to do. But there's another possibility that it is largely genetic. Not, lying isn't necessarily genetic, but fear of consequences, fear in general is seemingly somewhat genetic, like your propensity to be afraid. There's people who are born seemingly with a high degree of propensity to fear, and people in the average and people at the low end of the spectrum. And to some extent, getting in trouble and social rejection will cause fear in the child such that they will learn from their mistakes and try to avoid that in the future. And if the child doesn't feel much fear in general, then it takes a lot longer for them to learn a lesson, for example, to not lie. Also, there seem to be some genetic components to empathy for other human beings. And it's possible that and you didn't include this in the email, it's possible that he generally just doesn't really care, doesn't really connect with other people. The other possibilities is that although you think you're not providing some sort of fear in him regarding telling the truth, he might actually be experiencing it, either because you're unaware of how you're coming across, which, let's just say that's not likely the case, but it's possible. I've been with enough families to know that's true. Also, it's possible that the way you parent might have actually in the past made your kid feel afraid, even though most kids wouldn't react that way. You can parent your kid really well, and your kid just interprets it in this really wildly odd manner, and that's why it's important to kind of monitor those things, see how they're reacting. But let's just say that's probably also not it. Other things that could have happened was when children have early childhood attachment disruption. I don't know, Jen, but depending on who was taking care of him, 0 to 2 years old, primarily, and their mood and their capacity for attunement. Maybe someone was depressed or anxious or overworked, or they had an illness or something that can affect the child's connection with other human beings. And sometimes a side effect or a symptom of lack of general connection with other human beings can be compulsive lying. And I've seen that before as well. I'll see it in adoption, this kind of thing. Doesn't sound like there's any evidence of that. So I don't know. There's a lot of other possibilities as well. He could be experiencing things at school that are causing this, that's out of your awareness to some extent, out of your control to some extent. Also, you might be framing it as compulsive lying when it actually is kind of maybe just a little bit above average lying, right? Like to you, maybe you grew up without very much lying going around, and so maybe he has slightly above average lying, and it's very alarming to you. You're just like, it's very foreign to you, and it's not actually in the category that I would say is concerning, right? So these are all reasons why you should go to a family therapist, someone who knows about these kinds of things. You can really assess this and try to figure out how to address it. All right, this next email is from anonymous upper tier patron. She says, would you please talk about intuition versus projecting? My intuition alone has saved me more than once, and I really believe it is a useful tool to use, especially in potentially dangerous situations. I'm concerned that by you recommending trying to be too differentiated, we could dismiss completely something valid that our gut is trying to tell us. I think some of your series show how difficult it can be to separate genuine helpful intuition from unhelpful and unfair projection, and I'd love it if you could talk about that a bit more. End of email. Yeah, so it's a great question. Of course, it's hard to tell, and maybe I don't emphasize this enough, but absolutely. Intuition, I mean, what do we mean by intuition? It's really important to identify that, because on one hand, intuition is our ability to pick up on data. When I'm talking with a client, a lot of the data that the client is presenting is not registering with me super consciously. Like when I'm talking with a new client and I start to get this feeling in my gut, in my torso, that I'm afraid of the client, I'm afraid of making a mistake in the first session, often that is a red flag or a yellow flag at the very least for someone who has a personality disorder of some kind. And I've learned that over time, that when it's a very specific fear I feel, not only with these clients, but along those lines, when I run into people in my personal life and I get that same exact feeling in my chest, then I sometimes wonder what's going on. Does this person have a perceptual problem that's leading them to have subtle hostilities towards me, and I'm picking up on them and I'm afraid of them? That's why I'm having this feeling. And then, of course, I have all these thoughts that sort of generate from that fear, like get away from this person, or try to please them, or I'm screwing up, or I'm not a good therapist, or, those are the thoughts that generate from that emotion. So we could call that intuition. I don't call that intuition. I mean, maybe I would sometimes, but really what I'm talking about is I am picking up on, I'm observing data consciously or subconsciously that is giving me reason to feel as though there's a threat. My perceptions are causing my nervous system to feel like this person will harm me somehow. And then I start to feel afraid, and then my body feels a certain way, and then I notice that. So would we call that intuition, or would we call that picking up on data? I don't know. Now, another definition or usage of the word intuition is when people are talking about like psychic energies or something. Like one might have an intuition that there will be a hurricane tomorrow when you're not a meteorologist, or One could have an intuition that aliens will land in New York City next year and will make themselves known. That some people might call that an intuition. There's no data to have that conclusion. You're just basically, you have a gut feeling or a hunch, and it's a fantasy that might actually come true because you might just be coincidentally predicting something that will happen. But it's not observable by science. It's not even really likely that it is a mechanism that's real. Confirmation bias, all that kind of thing. So, and then there's a lot of things in between, right? There's a lot of usages of the word intuition in between. But to be clear, that when I have what I would call my intuition, I guess, I never take it at face value. I'm never just like, oh, I have fear, thus this client that I don't know that much about has a personality disorder or has borderline or something. I never do that. I always will be skeptical to a great degree. I'm like, well, maybe I just have indigestion, or maybe I'm just making something up, or maybe I'm afraid of something else, or maybe this person is just kind of mildly threatening and it doesn't have anything to do with a personality disorder. I don't know. Maybe they're afraid of me for some weird reason and they're being hostile. There's just a lot of possibilities, and so you always have to wonder if you are quote unquote projecting. It's not actually projection. It's distorting or displacing or transference or something, technically speaking. And so you always have to be differentiated. You always have to have a question mark. You can't take your gut feeling or even your conclusions based on data in a psychological sense, because it's such a squishy form of science. You can't ever take it at face value. You always have to have a question mark around it. Now, at some point, you have to take action, right, as a therapist. Like, for me, I can never know. Like, let's say that I believe that someone has preoccupied attachment. And let's say I even propose that to the client, describe it, and the client says, yes, I think I do have preoccupied attachment. Do I know scientifically 100% sure that the person does indeed have preoccupied attachment? No, I don't know, because the client could be lying to me. The client could be just agreeing with me. I could be distorted. I could misunderstand what the client is trying to tell me. Like, there's just a lot of factors that could lead to a false conclusion, an unhelpful conclusion. But at some point, I have to conclude something so I can at least try to treat something, right? If I have no conceptualization, then I don't know what I'm doing. I need to have some idea about what I should be treating. And so even though I'm not 100% sure, I'm operating from the educated guess based on data and confirmation and collaboration with the client that this is likely what is wrong, or at least one of the things that we need to be working on. And so let's proceed. And then if the treatment actually helps the client. Now, here's the other thing. Let's say that I proceed with the treatment based on preoccupied attachment, and then like 10 weeks later, the client tells me that the treatment has helped them and the conceptualization must have been right. I still can't know if any of it is right, because the client could be lying to me. The client could be deluded. The client could be trying to please me. The client could have never had preoccupation, or if they did, they could be just trying to tell me that the treatment is working. I don't know. I'm not there. I'm not with them, and it's a subjective thing anyway. So, in psychology, when we think about this question as you're posing it, intuition versus projection, or displacement or distortion, there's just no way to know, and thus you should always have a question mark. And that's what differentiation is the ability to look at yourself and your conclusions, your bias, your emotions, and go, I don't know. Let's ask some questions. At some point, I might have to operate. Like, let's say you're saying that your intuition alone has saved you in some dangerous situations. So I don't know, but let's say that you're on a date with someone and your intuition is telling you that this guy is dangerous. And so you decide to end the date early, and you go home. And then later that night, he texts you and he's threatening to you and is abusive. And you're just like, ooh, dodge that bullet. I didn't have any real reason to believe he was abusive, but I must have been picking up on something. Okay. So on one hand, you could frame it as some sort of psychic intuition, some sort of gut feeling based on some supernatural thing. That's fine. You could also, the way I would frame it is you were picking up on personality and behavioral cues that reminded you of people in the past, or at least to some extent that gave your body enough reason to conclude that there was a danger there, or he was being legit hostile and maybe his hand movements were a little more aggressive, or his tone of voice, or the things he decided to say in the moment. They weren't like overtly aggressive or controlling, but they had sort of elements of it. And your body was picking up on those data, but it was kind of out of your awareness. And then as time went on, you just had this growing fear. And by the time you noticed the fear, you hadn't really known that you were cataloging a lot of data points to give you that fear. And then you went home. So what do we call that, right? Now, in that moment, you could, so you're in the car and you're getting a gut feeling, and you're like, I think this guy's dangerous. I should go home. Okay. So differentiation in that moment, means that you look at yourself and have a question mark. But I want everyone to understand this, because a lot of times when people understand Bowenian theory, they walk away with this false notion that when you look at your emotions, you're supposed to discount them and not pay attention to them. No. Differentiation is the ability to differentiate and see different parts of your guidance system, the emotional guidance system, and your reasoning. And a large part of that is you have the ability to look at each of them and see them as separate. So you see your gut feeling, you're in the car with him, and you're like, I'm having a gut feeling. And you look at it and you take a few seconds to think, do I have any data? Do I have any reason as to why I'm feeling afraid of this guy? I'm picking up on something. So that's differentiation, the ability to just kind of look at it for a second. And let's say that you can't answer that question. You're like, yeah, I don't know. There's really no data there. I can't remember him doing anything that was overtly aggressive. So differentiation is that ability. Now, what do you do from there? Well, on one hand, someone who will bastardize Bowenian theory will say, if you look at the feeling and you don't have any reason to have the feeling, then you need to discount the feeling. No. So you could, a truly differentiated person in that moment, as I'm describing it, would say, I'm having a gut feeling of fear. I can't think of any reason why I would have this fear. But when I zoom out and differentiate from the entire situation and look down on it, I don't need to stay on this date with this guy. And if he's a good guy, he'll let me go home and I'll reevaluate and I can think about it and maybe we'll have a second date later. There's no reason why I have to stay with this guy, because, another feeling I'm having is I don't want to hurt his feelings and I don't want to be mean to him. I don't want to be seen as a jerk face. Okay, I'm having that feeling, of that guilty feeling of rejecting him. Well, let me differentiate from that and say, is that rational in this moment? No, because if he's going to be that butthurt by me wanting to, end the date a little early, then, I don't want to date him anyway. So I'm going to differentiate from that feeling. The other thing is, what about another feeling I'm having of like, well, what if I screw this up? What if I, go home and I end up rejecting this guy and everything falls apart and it's because I did it again. I'm a failure at dating again. All right, let me differentiate from that feeling and say, well, the stakes are so high. Like, what if my gut is right? What if I have been picking up on some subtle clues that this guy is abusive? And I guilt myself into staying because I'm so desperate to find a partner. And plus, like, me ending the date earlier doesn't mean that we won't be able to connect later on if I conclude that my gut feeling wasn't warranted. So when I differentiate and recognize all my feelings, even though I have no data to back up this gut feeling of fear I have, I'm going to go the fuck home. And when I do so, I'll reevaluate because there's no emergency here. And that's differentiation, right? It's the ability to look at your feelings, to reason, and to make a choice that is best for you based on all the things. An undifferentiated person would, there's a lot of different things that they would do. One is, as soon as they felt fear, they would run out the door, or they would accuse him of being abusive. Like, you're being abusive, when there's no data there that he's being abusive. Possible that you just have indigestion or something, or that something about him is just reminding you of a past partner that was abusive, but this person is not abusive. Another version of an undifferentiated person is to go home, to stay with the person and to guilt themselves into staying even though their gut wants them to leave. So undifferentiation isn't not listening to your gut. A differentiated person, I want to be clear, a differentiated person pays attention to their emotions. They listen to their intuition, or whatever you want to call it. They listen to their gut. They value it. They just don't automatically go with it. That's the key. They might decide to go with it because they have the ability to look at it. They have the ability to reason about it. And the scenario that I laid out, if I were in that situation and I were differentiated, and then maybe I wouldn't be, but if I were, I would reason the stakes are too high to stay. I don't have data to back up this gut feeling, but the consequences are far too great for me to stay. And I don't need to stay, so I'm going home. And I might be listening to a gut feeling that is wrong, but better safe than sorry, because I don't want to be harmed. I don't want to be stuck in a car with an abusive person. That would be a horrible situation. I don't know this person. I'm going home. So that's my version of a very differentiated person. All right, let's take a break. We'll get back, more emails. All right, this next email is from anonymous upper tier patron. She writes, is it actually possible for someone to fall in love with themselves? End of email. Yeah, it's called autoromanticism or autoromantic, and there's also autosexuality. And some consider it to be a part of the asexual spectrum, the ace spectrum. And basically it's defined as someone who is either romantically or sexually oriented toward themselves. And although that might sound very pathological and problematic, it's not. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Bottom line, we really need to reduce the stigma for everyone on the ace spectrum, whether it's asexuality, aromanticism, autosexual, autoromantic, demisexual. We need to reduce stigma for it all because it's not a problem. It's not some scary, weird, crazy, scary thing. It's just, it's fine, right? What's the difference? What's it to you if someone is sexually attracted only to themselves or only wants to be romantic with themselves? It's like, it doesn't harm you, so, let it go, people. All right, this next email is from upper tier patron Jasmine. She writes, are psychosomatic symptoms delusions? I recently fell down a rabbit hole learning about Morgellons disease. I found a documentary from a few years ago called Skin Deep, The Battle of Morgellons, and there were a lot of people claiming the disease was only psychosomatic and a result of delusions. It appears to me that it could be considered more of a somatic OCD type thing than a delusion. Is there a clear difference, or could symptoms of somatic OCD be defined as delusional as well? End of email. Yeah, so first off, in our field, we tend to use different words than psychosomatic. Psychosomatic, I don't know when that was introduced, but I remember using that term when I was a kid. So I think at some point our field adopted a different term. The terms that we tend to use are just plainly somatic or psychogenic or conversions. There are other words as well, but essentially what we're talking about when we talk about Morgellons disease, and I'm not an expert, but from what I understand, it's people will have, they'll come into their physician and they'll have rashes and skin irritation, and they'll report feeling as though there are bugs eating their skin, and they'll say like, I have this, look at this rash, and want a diagnosis and want treatment, and then the physician will conduct tests and find that there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with the skin. There's no identifiable issue, and the conclusion will be that the client suffers from some sort of mental disorder. And how do we classify it? Well, Morgellons disease is one of the classifications. Other people might classify it as a somatic issue, meaning that stress or trauma or something, delusions are causing skin rashes, either because the person is scratching it a lot, either when they're awake or when they're asleep, and that's causing the rash. Or you can literally just cause stress-induced physical symptoms. We tend to think of like, well, if the person has a rash, it certainly can't be a psychogenic or a conversion issue because you can see the rash, you can measure it, you can look at the rash under a microscope and see that there's inflammation and there's issues there. It can't possibly be generated in the mind, and that's not true. We can generate a lot of problems in the mind. And I won't go into all the science on it because it's not really my area, but I know enough to know that one can, through stress or even just being obsessed with skin rashes, develop skin rashes, like measurable skin rashes. So there's that. And the other thing I'll say is that if you know anything about science and medicine, you understand that we do not know everything about medicine now. In 2023, we know a lot of things, but we do not know everything. And so there are a lot of conditions that are currently classified as psychogenic or a patient just overly complaining that in 100 years they will say, no, those people were actually suffering from a thing that they just didn't have the ability to detect. They didn't know what to look for. They didn't know how to figure this out. So, but we don't know. Now, it's possible that Morgellons disease and all the people who complain in this area, that none of them have a legit, so to speak, physical issue that is, invasive to their body. But we just don't know. It's just a big question mark, right? We don't know what we don't know. So there's that. But what you're asking is there a clear difference between what one would call Morgellons disease or OCD or delusions? So the word delusion is, and even the umbrella of OCD, it just depends on your definition of it, because you're right to possibly connect OCDs with delusions, because some manifestations of OCD are definitely what you could call delusional. I mean, there are people who will, they'll just be walking down the street and believe that there are germs just falling all over them and they need to bleach their entire body, and they can sense the germs all over them. And there's also versions of OCD where someone believes that God is going to kill them if they don't pray 10 times a day. There's no evidence to support that, but they just believe it. It sounds delusional, and you could categorize it as such, but we categorize it as OCD instead. In the past, we might have categorized it as schizophrenia or a delusion. Are psychosomatic symptoms delusions? They can be, and it depends on your definition. That's how I'll answer it. But it doesn't really matter how we define it, right? It matters what it means for treatment, right? So with people who have psychogenic issues like this, if the conclusion is, because you can never know, like I said, someone comes in with a rash, they complain they have bugs, and you try to talk to them, and they're just like convinced that they have bugs, and they're convinced they have some sort of massive problem with their skin. And you run a bunch of tests, and the consensus is there's likely some sort of psychogenic issue here, maybe some sort of OCD-related thing or something. And so you go with that conceptualization, you start to treat them, then you stop applying actual creams that can cause side effects that would be bad for them, right? Because a lot of medications and creams have side effects that aren't welcomed. Instead, you might just prescribe just a general lotion, over-the-counter lotion or something, and then you do psychotherapy, and the therapist who might have an expertise in this area starts to explore traumas, start to explore their automatic thoughts, their overall stress level, their sleep, their drug use, because sometimes, people can use, methamphetamine or cocaine, and it can exacerbate, even cause this kind of delusion or this kind of disorder of psychogenic worries about these sorts of things. And so you start to treat those things, and over time, as you treat those things, the Morgellons disease, or the concern about the rash and the literal rash, goes away. And you don't know, but you could conclude pretty strongly, but you'll never know for sure, that you were dealing with someone who did not have what one would consider to be a functional problem with their skin, meaning that there were bugs on their skin, or there was some sort of allergic reaction, or there wasn't anything like that. It was truly psychogenic as a result of their traumas or OCD or something. And by treating the stress and the trauma and the automatic thoughts and the relaxation, addressed it. So yeah. And more so in the past, there were a lot of people who had similar issues, what we called conversions, where someone would go blind, or they would go numb, or they become paralyzed, or they wouldn't be able to speak, and it was psychogenic. And no matter what you did, the person legitimately could not feel below their waist, or they legitimately could not see anything. It wasn't just fakery. It was totally legit. And by helping them with their trauma or their grief or their attachments or listening to their feelings, it alleviates the core issue, and thus the conversion of the stress into blindness or numbness went away. We don't see that so much anymore in Western society, but we still see it around the world. And the idea is that as society changes its idea of what pathology or the manifestation of pathology changes, then conversions change, meaning that you'd be hard-pressed to find a contemporary Western, cultural person, a contemporary American who even knows about numbness as a result of stress or blindness because of stress. But 100 years ago in the States, most people did know about these kinds of things because it was more prevalent. And so the idea goes is that as the human experiences stress, subconsciously, the human in their nervous system will manifest that stress in a way that they hope will be interpreted as stress. Think of it like there's a person inside of them going, I'm stressed out, I'm stressed out, I'm stressed out. Well, we need help, we need help, we need help. Well, the ego steps in the way and says, but you can't ask for help because that means you're weak. And so the stressed out person is like, well, we need to sneak a message to the outside. And so we know that we heard down the street when Aunt Martha had, temporary blindness, that she got a bunch of attention and a bunch of help. So maybe let's try that. So the self subconsciously develops this blindness and actually shuts down the visual system such that the person is legit blind because they suspect they will get the attention and the help that they need. And in other cultures, that's still the case. Whereas today in the United States, that isn't out there. So we have other ways of subverting the ego to get help. There will be, like becoming depressed or drinking too much or losing your job or becoming a QAnon supporter, like legit. That's the idea anyway, because it does seem to manifest differently in different cultures and different times. The prevalence of conversions changes over time, and you're just like, well, it must have to do with culture, right? Because it's not like genetically we're different than we were before, really. So there must be something that's getting into the subconscious and causing this manifestation to happen. And you could argue that Morgellons disease is another one of those things, that the individual needs help, but because the ego gets in the way and says, no, you can't ask for help or you don't deserve help or something, the body says, well, fuck it, I'll just create this rash and I will convince the person that there's bugs crawling over them, because surely they will go to the physician then. Someone will look into it and we'll just get some help, and maybe that will cause them to find someone to help us. We don't know exactly who that is, but now, of course, there's a lot of problems with the way I describe that whole thing, but, I hope you get the picture. All right, so let's take a break. And actually, the rest of this episode will just be for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to become a patron of the podcast, you can, and you'll get access to the rest of this episode and all the other episodes in which are just for patrons. So do so now if you want.